what happened to Jimmy Hoffa? Hard to believe, but it's been nearly 5 decades. We're talking 50 years since the labor leader vanished, believed to be on his way to a meeting with 2 top Detroit and New Jersey mobsters.
The disappearance of Jimmy Hoffa is America's most famous cold case. 50 years of searching and not a single trace. Now, Michael Franzese, a man who escaped the mob with his life, says he's ready to end the mystery.
You have some idea where Jimmy Hoffa is buried or where his body was dumped off?
Yes.
He claims that before he passes, he will reveal everything about the conspiracy that took Hoffa down. This isn't speculation. Franzese was a capo, an insider who knew the players.
I believe that the shooter is still alive. I'm going to tell you this. He's not a made guy. He wasn't one of us. He was given the order. I knew the guy.
He says he has the details of that final day and the identity of the man who really pulled the trigger when the most powerful man disappeared. To understand the weight of Michael Franzese's shocking claim, we have to travel back. We need to go to a time when one man, Jimmy Hoffa, was arguably more powerful than many politicians, maybe even some presidents. So here's the deal with Jimmy Hoffa. His disappearance is the stuff of legend. Hoffa wasn't just some labor union leader, he was a force of nature. He was an influential figure who went from working on docks and in warehouses to becoming the boss of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, or IBT. This organization, as ordinary as it sounds, was the lifeblood of the nation. What most people don't realize is that the Teamsters controlled the movement of almost every single product in North America. If the Teamsters stopped, the country stopped. And Hoffa was the man with his finger on the switch. But he didn't start at the top. He wasn't born with a silver spoon. In fact, it was nothing close to it. He came from humble beginnings in Indiana. He started working menial jobs under harsh conditions at the age of 8 after his father, a coal miner, passed away. He did that kind of backbreaking labor for 11 years. The crazy part is, even as a teenager, he was a fighter. He organized his first strike at just 17, a quickie strike that caught the bosses completely off guard and won his fellow workers a raise. He was a natural leader and everyone knew him for his charm and how he could easily relate with people. It was this natural skill, this fire, that caught the attention of the IBT. Shortly after, he joined the organization as a business agent and, well, he rose up the ranks faster than anyone had ever seen. As the leader of the union, he was unbelievably influential. His influence stretched to major cities that danced to his tune. Everyone knew only he could make or break even the biggest corporations and political bodies in the country. He famously unified all the truckers under one single national agreement, something that was thought to be impossible. He built a union with over 2 million members. No one knew for sure how he came to be the man that he was known for, but he did most of it. And let's be honest, he was known to have made it to the top of the food chain by getting involved in some very dirty business. He wasn't afraid to use muscle. Accounts from his former colleagues recounted that he knew how to relate well with truck drivers, warehouse workers, and even loaders. He made them promises that they would get rewarded if they followed his lead. And of course, he never broke his promise. That was how he built a localized team who were fiercely loyal to him. But his real smarts and his eventual downfall were all about the union's treasury. More specifically, the Central States Pension Fund. This treasury wasn't like any other savings account for retirees. This account had hundreds of millions of dollars stacked up. We're talking about a river of cash, maybe billions in today's money. And this account got the attention of the mafia. What most people don't realize is that this fund was basically the mob's personal bank. It was an unsecured piggy bank they could crack open any time to finance everything. They used it to build the glamorous new casinos that were springing up in Las Vegas, places like the Stardust and the Desert Inn. And as you'd expect, who better than Hoffa became the key to unlocking this unlimited wealth? This is how things began to take a dark turn. In no time, Hoffa's relationship with organized crime, particularly powerful groups like the Detroit and Sicilian mob factions, wasn't just business as usual. It was a partnership. Typically, both sides would benefit. The mob provided the muscle and the intimidation to keep the union in line and crush any resistance. In return, Hoffa provided the avenue for money to be borrowed from the pension fund to keep things running smoothly. It was a trade that worked for years, but it was always a deal with the devil. The mob had leverage over Hoffa, and he knew too many of their secrets. He knew where all the bodies were buried, figuratively and maybe literally. However, things started to get a bit shaky. Hoffa's power made him a target for the government, especially Robert F. Kennedy, who made it his personal mission to take Hoffa down. Eventually, they got him. Hoffa was sent to prison for jury tampering and fraud. This is when he made a fatal mistake. He put a man named Frank Fitzsimmons in charge as his replacement, thinking Fitzy would just keep his seat warm. Yeah, about that. Fitzsimmons loved being the boss. And the mob, they loved him even more. He was compliant. He let them have anything they wanted from the pension fund, no questions asked. The gravy train was running faster than ever. Then Hoffa got out. President Nixon commuted his sentence, but with a catch. Hoffa was barred from all union activity until 1980. This was a death sentence for a man like Hoffa. He immediately started fighting it in court. He was planning to retake the union leadership, and he was threatening to expose everything Fitzsimmons and the mob had been doing. He became a liability. He knew too much and was suddenly way too stubborn. This tense situation came to a head on a hot, sticky afternoon on July 30th, 1975. Hoffa was last seen outside the Macious Red Fox restaurant in Bloomfield Township, Michigan. He was supposed to be there for a sit-down with two key mob figures, Detroit boss Anthony Tony Jack Giacalone and the well-known New Jersey mobster Anthony Tony Pro Provenzano. Hoffa and Tony Pro hated each other. They'd had a massive fight in prison, but Hoffa thought this was a peace meeting. But here's the catch. They were no-shows. Hoffa waited, getting more and more agitated. He called his wife from a payphone to let her know he was coming home. Unfortunately for him, that call was the last time he was heard from. Just like that, poof! Jimmy Hoffa was nowhere to be found. It was as if he was just deleted from existence. There were no signs of a struggle, no witnesses, and no ransom note. What was left was just his car, unlocked in the parking lot. The biggest union boss in America was gone without a trace. This was the biggest missing person case in modern history and a terrifying display of how much unchecked power these organizations had. Even after decades of investigations, Hoffa's remains have never been found. After nearly 50 years, the mystery is still very much talked about. The FBI has relentlessly pursued clues, digging up fields, scanning under bridges, and even taking apart houses, hoping one day to find that final piece of physical evidence. But what if they've been looking in the wrong place for the wrong kind of evidence? What if one man who saw the inner workings of the mafia was the piece of the puzzle to the mystery? Not only is he a high-ranking insider, but he also just might know the location of Jimmy Hoffa's remains and have the actual name of the triggerman. That man is Michael Franzese, and his story, well, it changes everything. The insider who knows everything. Michael Franzese wasn't your typical street thug, and that's putting it lightly. He was born into a life of crime, into mob royalty. His father was John Sonny Franzese. Sonny was the legendary and deeply feared underboss of the Colombo crime family. This was a guy who was rumored to have taken out dozens of people, a true old-school gangster who lived to be over 100 years old and reportedly never broke the code of silence. But Michael, he was different. At a younger age, he chose to take a different path. He was actually a pre-med student, smart and with a bright future. But when his father was sentenced to 50 years in prison, Michael dropped out of college. He felt he had to step up and protect his family. He took the oath and became a made man in the Colombo family. Unlike what you'd expect, he was educated, slick, and sharp. He wasn't breaking legs, he was reading balance sheets. This earned him the name Yuppie Don. At the peak of his reign, he rose to become a capo regime, or captain. This meant he had his own crew and was a major earner in one of New York's famed 5 families. He was a guy who understood numbers and corporate structures better than the old-school mobsters, which allowed him to innovate criminal schemes that were shockingly profitable. His most notorious and profitable hustle, and the one that put him on the map, was the massive gasoline tax fraud. So here's the deal on how it worked. It was pure genius in a criminal way. Basically, Franzese and his crew set up a complex web of shell companies. These companies would sell gas wholesale from one fake company to the next. Each time they would collect the state and federal gas taxes. But before the government came to collect those taxes, they'd just dissolve the company, file for bankruptcy, and the money would just disappear. This scheme was pulling in millions of dollars. Some estimates say at his peak, Franzese's operation was bringing in $8 or $9 million a week. He was so successful and innovative that Vanity Fair magazine featured him, ranking him as one of the biggest earners in the entire American mafia, right alongside John Gotti. This broad-day, industrial-scale theft seemed normal and everyone just flowed with it. He was living large with jets, mansions, and helicopters. Everything went smoothly until things changed. And the change wasn't a rival mobster, it was a woman. While shooting a movie, one of his legitimate businesses, he met Camille Garcia, a dancer in the film. He fell in love. At the same time, the law was closing in. He was indicted on multiple counts of racketeering and fraud. This change solidified his fame and earned him a lifelong hatred from his former associates. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, after serving time and facing further charges, Franzese made a dramatic and unbelievable decision. He decided to leave the mafia. What most people don't realize is that this isn't something you just do. You can't just hand in a resignation letter. This was a blood oath, La Cosa Nostra, this thing of ours. It's for life. Leaving is a choice that in that life is supposed to be punishable by only one thing: being permanently taken off the map. His own father, Sonny, disowned him for it. A contract was put on his life. But Franzese did it. He walked away from the life and has never looked back. He successfully became one of the few high-ranking members ever to survive this choice and publicly speak about it. And get this, he did it without going into the witness protection program. He served his time, got out, and started a new life. This conversion and subsequent departure launched him into a new career as a legitimate public speaker, author, and media personality. He shares his incredible life story around the world, talking about his past and his newfound faith. This brings us to his most important asset, his credibility. When Michael Franzese talks about how the mob operates, what they discuss behind closed doors, and who is involved in major jobs, people listen. Why? Because he was one of the guys at the head of the table. He was a capo. He was the prince of the mafia. He knows the code, he knows the rules, and he knew the players. So what is the name he's finally ready to reveal regarding the Hoffa job? And what exact evidence led him to this truth after all these years? The theories that went cold. For nearly 50 years, the question of who was involved in Jimmy Hoffa's disappearance was the real topic of discussion. A lot of speculation surrounded the circumstances, but the most prominent theory was that he was taken out by a firearm. With the countless theories, rumors, and boasts that made the rounds, there had never been a definitive statement from a high-ranking mob insider. But with Franzese at the forefront claiming to know the identity of the actual triggerman, all hell is about to break loose. Surprisingly, even when Franzese did not outrightly mention any names for years, one particular name seems to come up in discussions relating to Hoffa's end and disappearance, and it's none other than Richard Kuklinski. Kuklinski, at the peak of his career, was an infamous contract specialist, known for his cold, calculated moves and his gruesome methods. They called him the Iceman. This guy was a notorious figure. His nickname came from his horrifying signature move of freezing his victims' remains to confuse the time of their passing. He worked for multiple crime families, particularly the DeMeo crew of the Gambino family. The crazy part is, Kuklinski loved to talk. In chilling interviews, he claimed to have taken out over 100 people, and he also claimed he was the one who ended Hoffa. He said he was part of the team, that he ended Hoffa with a sharp object, and that his remains were crushed in a car compactor. However, Kuklinski's claims of involvement in the Hoffa job were mostly dismissed as the exaggerations of a boastful, convicted man. Now the important question on everyone's mind, of course, is the source of Michael Franzese's information. He seemed like the kind of guy who wouldn't rely on hearsay, but rather get his information straight from the horse's mouth, so to speak. His claim is based on multiple conversations and corroborating stories he heard from his own associates and high-ranking contacts within the Colombo family and connected New York crime families. Don't forget, Franzese was a successful capo. He operated at the level where major jobs and inter-family business were discussed. In these dealings, stories were passed around confirming who was actually hired for the Hoffa job. As for the timeline of this discovery, Franzese says this information came to him over many years, starting well before he left the mafia. However, he was bound by the code of silence, omerta. This meant discussing the details of another family's sanctioned business was strictly forbidden and very, very dangerous. Once he became a public figure, he was still cautious. He spent years compiling and cross-referencing the claims he heard from various sources before deciding he had enough confirmation. He took it up a notch after being interviewed, where he says that it's deep. He also goes on to hint that he has in his possession a recorded tape that spells everything out and might release it later. But this is exactly where there's a sharp contrast, because Franzese's claim does not point the finger at Kuklinski. In fact, Michael Franzese has been explicitly clear in publicly dismissing Richard Kuklinski's confession. Franzese asserts that Kuklinski was a pathological liar, someone who loved to take credit for high-profile crimes he had absolutely nothing to do with. According to Franzese, Kuklinski was not involved in the Hoffa job, and any supposed confession of his is just another distraction in a long list of false leads. What most people don't realize is why the mob wouldn't use him. Franzese says the mafia would never use a wild card like Kuklinski, a non-Italian freelance contractor, for a job of this magnitude. This was arguably the most sensitive, high-profile job in mob history. They needed precision and, above all, discretion. They would use their own trusted made guys. But Kuklinski isn't the only distraction. The most famous, and let's be honest, most cinematic account came from the 2004 book, I Heard You Paint Houses. This was the basis for the massive Hollywood movie, The Irishman. The author, Charles Brandt, claimed that Frank the Irishman Sheeran, an alleged professional for the mob and a longtime friend of Hoffa, confessed on his deathbed to being the one. Painting houses was mob code for, well, you know. Sheeran claimed he was the one who shot Hoffa inside that local Detroit house, a final sad betrayal. He then said Hoffa's remains were taken to a crematorium and incinerated. But here's the catch. A lot of experts, and guys like Franzese, call foul on this too. They point out that Sheeran was, well, Irish. The mafia, especially for a job this sensitive, would almost never use an outsider. They would use a made man, a full-blooded Italian. Plus, the logistics of the story, the specific house, many say it just doesn't add up. So Franzese's inside information refutes the fact that Kuklinski or Sheeran was ever involved. But this case isn't just about the man who committed the crime, it's about the top guys pulling the strings. The conspiracy to end a king. To answer that, we have to look back at the ticking time bomb that was Hoffa's parole. It wasn't just a personal feud, it was about money, billions of dollars. As we said, Hoffa was arrested and sentenced to 13 years in prison for jury tampering and misusing funds from the Teamsters Pension Fund in 1967. He was later released from federal prison in 1971 after President Nixon commuted his sentence. However, the release came with that massive condition. Hoffa had to be barred from any union activity until 1980. This condition essentially sidelined the most dominant union leader in American history. But Jimmy Hoffa was not a man who sat still. He was actively, aggressively, and publicly fighting this restriction in court. He was determined to retake his throne long before 1980. This fight created a direct and massive threat to the status quo. While Hoffa was in prison, his hand-picked successor, Frank Fitzsimmons, took over the Teamsters presidency. And what most people don't realize is that Fitzsimmons was a puppet. He was a compliant figure who was perfectly happy to let the mafia continue using the vast Teamsters Central States Pension Fund as their personal slush fund. We're talking about loans for casinos, for resorts, for any project the bosses wanted. And these loans were often given with no collateral and were never paid back. Without the Teamsters Pension Fund, Vegas as we know it might not exist. We're talking legendary spots like the Stardust, the Fremont, and the Desert Inn. The mob would get loans for millions, money that was supposed to be for truck drivers' retirement, and use it to build their desert palaces. Then they'd skim the profits right off the top before it was ever counted. It was the perfect money machine. And Fitzsimmons, he just looked the other way. Hoffa coming back meant the party was over. The gravy train was about to hit the brakes. Knowing how unpredictable Hoffa was and his hatred for the fact the mob had turned his union into a criminal enterprise, he took a solid stance. His aggressive plan to retake the presidency threatened the financial pipeline and the quiet control the mob had established. And get this, it wasn't just business. Hoffa and Tony Provenzano hated each other. They'd had a massive, violent falling out while serving time together in prison. For the mob, the only way to stop Hoffa was a permanent one. The order to take out Hoffa required a consensus. This wasn't a street-level decision. The mafia, which runs on structure, needed approval from the Commission, the ruling body of the American Mafia. A target as high-profile as Hoffa? You needed a unanimous vote. The key families involved were the Detroit Partnership, who hosted the meeting, the powerful Genovese family in New York, Tony Pro's family, and elements of the Chicago outfit. With a clear consensus agreeing that Hoffa's return was bad for business across the entire country, Hoffa's life was worth less than the billions flowing from that pension fund. This multi-family agreement meant the planning of the job had to be carefully planned. It seems the decision to eliminate Hoffa was a sanctioned job, giving the conspirators the protection of the entire criminal network. They lured him to the Machis Red Fox with the promise of that peace meeting, guaranteeing he'd come alone and without extra security. They needed to move him quickly and quietly from the restaurant to a secure location. It was a cold, calculated operation. The crazy part is how they got him in the car. One figure often mentioned in this shadowy movement is Charles "Chucky" O'Brien. This wasn't just some associate. O'Brien was practically Hoffa's foster son. Hoffa had raised him. The theory is that O'Brien was the one driving the car that picked Hoffa up at the restaurant. Hoffa would have trusted him, thinking Chucky was just taking him to the real meeting. While O'Brien always denied any involvement, many investigators believe he was the one who delivered Hoffa to his end. It was the ultimate betrayal. It is without a doubt that the order to make Hoffa disappear came from the top. The execution was a chilling piece of mob tradecraft, requiring a secure location and a final disposal plan designed for maximum secrecy, a plan that has kept the evidence hidden for 50 years. The Ryko Act's revenge. The entire operation, from the lure to the execution, was planned with an urgent need for speed and secrecy. Hoffa was not a nobody. He was a giant whose absence would be noticed immediately. Furthermore, he was constantly under surveillance by the FBI. The team had to commit the act, deal with the remains, and clear the scene before federal agents or Hoffa's own security realized he was permanently missing. This required a level of cold precision that only the highest echelon of professional criminals could manage. The mission was accomplished in minutes, ensuring the evidence was quickly removed. Once Hoffa had successfully been taken out, the real work began, erasing any trace of him. This move alone has left investigators at a roadblock for half a century and created one of the greatest riddles in criminal history. The pursuit of those behind his disappearance was one thing, but the power Hoffa had and the money he controlled is the real story. His downfall was not necessarily about revenge, it was about money. The financial motive was the bone of contention. The job was more about control of capital and ensuring their access to billions of dollars. Once Hoffa was gone, the post-Hoffa mob landscape solidified the mafia's control. Fitzsimmons stayed in power and the loans continued to flow. It wasn't until the mid-1980s that the federal government was finally able to break the structural link. They used the RICO Act. So here's the deal on RICO. It was a law that allowed prosecutors to go after the entire organization, not just one guy. If they could prove a pattern of criminal activity, they could take down the boss and all his captains. This is what finally crumbled the mob's power. In a way, the end of Jimmy Hoffa marked the peak of power for the American Mafia. It was perhaps the final, most brazen, high-profile act of their golden age. But success breeds arrogance. The Hoffa job drew a red line. The subsequent public outrage galvanized federal agencies. The federal focus intensified massively. This, combined with RICO, was the beginning of their end. But the question remains, where is he? The reason this mystery is still talked about is because so many people have stepped forward with different versions of the truth. We already talked about the Irishman, but there are more. Another major tip came in January 2013 from Tony Zerilli, a reputable Detroit gangster. Zerilli implied that Hoffa was originally buried in a shallow grave with the intention of moving his remains later, but those plans were abandoned. Cirilli claimed Hoffa's remains lay in a field in northern Oakland County, Michigan. On June 17, 2013, the FBI was led to a property there. After 3 days of digging, however, the FBI called off the search. No human remains were found. The FBI has their own list of main suspects. 2 names that constantly surfaced were brothers Thomas Andretta and Stephen Andretta. Both were New Jersey Teamsters officials and reputed associates of the Genovese crime family directly connected to Tony Pro. The FBI officially called Thomas Andretta a trusted associate or reported to be involved in the disappearance of Hoffa. The search continued. In October 2021, a major lead emerged from a deathbed statement by a landfill worker. He claimed to have buried Hoffa's remains in a steel drum 15 feet below the surface in a massive landfill beneath the Pulaski Skyway in Jersey City, New Jersey. The FBI obtained a warrant and completed a site survey using advanced ground-penetrating radar. Despite the hopeful news, the FBI announced in July 2022 that nothing of evidentiary value was discovered. This is what people watching this are looking for: a mystery. But are we missing a key detail? Is it possible all this happened so perfectly? The thing is, without the physical evidence, every claim remains a compelling but unprovable mob story. This brings us back to Michael Franzese. He cuts through all of it. He dismisses Kuklinski. He dismisses Sheeran. He holds to his story that he knows, from the highest levels, who was really there and who did the job. He claims he has the name and that before he dies, he'll reveal it. He's the last man standing who was in that world at that level and is willing to talk. But it's been 50 years. So what do you think? Will Michael Franzese finally reveal the truth, or is this the one secret the mob will successfully take to the grave? Let us know your theory in the comments. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more deep dives into stories just like this.